During this talk, I will try to reflect on ancient Greek social interaction and the role of Greek politeness, so to say, and provided that it is possible to adapt this quite modern concept to Greek good manners. The basis for these reflections would be the famous episode of Agariste of Sicyon's wedding banquet in the 6th book of the Histories. There, Herodotus tells how Cleisthenes, the tyrant of Sicyon, announced during the Olympic Games that any Greek wishing to marry his daughter and considering himself worthy should travel to Sicyon within 60 days. Cleisthenes first inquired the country and lineage of each, then he kept them with him for a year, testing their character and temper and upbringing and manners. This he did by consorting with them alone and in company, putting the younger of them to contests of strength, but especially watching their demeanor at the common meal. On the day of the wedding feast, to which he had invited all the citizens of Sicyon, Cleisthenes had not yet announced his decision. As the day went on and the drinking continued, the suitors engaged in a musical and rhetorical contest. No one could outperform Hippocleides, the preferred candidate of the tyrant. But all of a sudden, the young man asked for a table to be brought out, climbed atop it, and began to dance in a most indecent manner. And when Cleisthenes saw Hippocleides' bare legs waving around in the air, "Son of Tysandrus," he shouted, "you have danced away your marriage." The honor of marrying Agariste fell to another Athenian, Megacles, but the response of Hippocleides became proverbial. "Ufrontis Hippocleide." It does not matter to Hippocleides, or Hippocleides doesn't care. Thus ends this famous episode, which despite its anecdotal character is one of the best witnesses for the role played by good manners and politeness in archaic and classical Greek society. Until recently, Greek politeness has been understudied, largely due to the difficulties in connecting the Greek psychology of manners, so to say, with the concept of politeness, as inherited by 20th century sociology from medieval and modern Western cultures and the politeness manuals that those cultures produced. A few studies have, to be sure, been devoted to specific circumstances or discursive practices, but they remain primarily descriptive in nature. During the last years, focusing mainly, but not only on the Homeric epics, I have been trying to do something differently. Namely, I have attempted to investigate the social meaning of Greek politeness, approaching it as a body of interrelational rules shared within a society or a social group, deeply dependent on Greek social psychology and culture, and aiming at defining behavioral models appropriate for different social situations. When I read it, it's 4 lines long, and if I think that it took a year for me to develop it, I almost faint. Flowing through my interpretative attempt is the assessment of the behavior of others that characterizes the dominant ideology in Greek literary sources of the archaic and classical periods. As far as the sources allow us to judge, it seems likely that a Greek person of, say, 5th century BC Athens would assess the behavior of others via a particular kind of visual scrutiny, grounded in the idea of a profound unity between outer appearance and behavior on the one hand and inner disposition on the other. It is a type of judgment based on the premise that a man's outward appearances are directly related to his ethos. In this type of judgment, which I have called socio-aesthetic in my forthcoming book, there is no clear difference between bad behavior and bad nature. This is consistent with the Greek tendency not to separate the psyche, namely the principle of life, the essence, which is inside the body, from the exterior manifestations of the body itself. Since the body is a mirror of the inner state, it becomes the main factor for the archaic and classical Greek observer to understand someone else's innermost nature. Born among the elites, this ideology spread throughout the whole society, and it is precisely on the basis of it that Cleisthenes wants to judge his daughter's suitors in Herodotus' story. He tested their character and temper and upbringing and manners. A man's quality and character are reflected in his education and manners. As Athenaeus had already noted, faced with Hippocleides' outrageous behavior, Cleisthenes felt that the soul of the man matched his dance. Modern critics have analyzed Hippocleides' behavior from various angles. Today, I am going to interpret it from the point of view of its context, the wedding banquet where Herodotus situates the action, and of social expectations regarding the rules of politeness that everyone must follow in this particular type of situation. We will see that this approach allows us, on the one hand, to better situate Hippocleides' answer in relation to his dance, but it also allows us to expand upon Cleisthenes' reasons for publicly reprimanding the young man, for it would undoubtedly have been more elegant not to ruin the atmosphere of the party by simply ignoring the young man's dance and naming another candidate. But let us first consider the character of the story as Herodotus tells it and the social and political context in which it develops. According to the chronology of Cleisthenes of Sicyon, the feast that would have sealed the months of present of the suitors in the house of the tyrant should have taken place during the 70s of the 6th century. Although they do not deny the historicity of Agaristes' marriage, historians have repeatedly emphasized the literary character of this Herodotian episode. Fairly obvious historical inconsistencies, notably concerning the list of suitors and the chronological plausibility of an encounter between them, undermine the veracity of Herodotus' account. It is not unlikely that, by Herodotus' time, the events had already become anecdotal, perhaps even proverbial. This is why the Herodotian passage may also have an etiological function around the expression "Ufrontis Hippocleide," which was current in Athens as a way of saying, "I couldn't give a stuff." As for the narrative content of the anecdote, Hippocleides, son of Tysandrus, an archon in 566-65 BC, belonged to the family of the Philates, the same which gave birth to Miltiades and Cimon. As it is well known, during his time at the height of Athenian politics around 470-460 BC, Cimon promoted his family's role in the history of the city. This is what historians normally call the Philates tradition, which is partially known to us from a late antique life of Thucydides. As Brian Lavelle has pointed out, Herodotus' source for the vulgar dance of the young man and his failure to win the hand of Agariste is unlikely to derive from this family tradition, which held Hippocleides for one of its prestigious members. It is instead more likely that the Herodotian anecdote preserves traces of the tradition of another grand Athenian dynasty, the Alcmaeonids. Not only had Hippocleides lost the favor of Cleisthenes to Megacles, son of Alcmaeon, but during the decades that separated the wedding of Agariste and Herodotus' time in Athens, the Alcmaeonids had often been the political opponents of the Philates. Moreover, chapter 126-130, which contain the story of Hippocleides, are part of the famous section of Book 6 of the Histories, which historians refer to as the defense of the Alcmaeonids. To be sure, it is not the whole story of the wedding that would come from an Alcmaeonidian source, but only the detail of the vulgar dance by a prestigious opponent of Megacles. The historical Hippocleides, Lavelle concludes, was masked and costumed to some extent in the marriage of Agariste by the role that he must play for its authors, is nevertheless discernible in outline. That Megacles' victory would be measured against him implies reputation and status, and not just among the Athenians. Herodotus' sources had other options, but Hippocleides was somehow necessary to gauge Megacles' victory. Beyond the etiological function of the anecdote, the real issue at stake in this episode is, according to Lavelle, the rivalry for prestige between two great families of the Athenian elite class in search of greater social recognition between the middle of the 6th and the middle of the 5th century BC. This only increases the interest of this passage for our purposes. As Alain Dupuis has shown, The recognition of a high social status in archaic Greece was less a matter of belonging to a grand aristocratic family than of observing a number of practices of distinction, or, as he called them, modes de reconnaissance. Inasmuch as Greek aristocratic ideology stipulates that a man's ethos may be judged on the basis of his conduct, observance of the rules of politeness forms a part of such practices. If we accept that the anecdote of Hippocleides' dance echoes competition between two Athenian families for prestige, it becomes clear that it has been elaborated to emphasize, a contrario, these rules of politeness. Let us have a deeper look. Having proceeded to the ritual sacrifice, Cleisthenes opens up the wedding feast both to the suitors themselves and to all the Sicyonians. In this way, the feast actually looks like a hybrid banquet, one that mixes on the one hand the characteristics of a domestic symposium, restricted, and on the other hand, the characteristics of a public setting, such as a popular assembly or a civic banquet. At the center of the scene, the banquet of suitors closely resembles a traditional aristocratic symposium, that is to say, a rite in which the members of the elite not only elaborate, but also apply a degree of behavioral sophistication that they wish to promote within the whole society. Or at least, they wish to do so in words, for this sophistication actually functions as a sign of distinction between the group and the rest of the community. But in the particular case of Agaristes' wedding feast, all around this first group, there are individuals who are not, or not quite, part of the elite, namely the Sicyonians. Thanks to the social penetration of their leaders' ideals, these people probably have more than a cursory knowledge of the rules of politeness that are in force in the upper social strata. Moreover, as long as they do not consciously criticize the whole structure of society, they have a sort of deferential admiration mixed with envious spite for these rules, which makes them a demanding public, ready to stigmatize the morals of the elite at the slightest sign of failure on their part. This idea forms the basis of my contextual analysis of the behavior of both Hippocleides and Cleisthenes. Because the tyrant had invited all the Sicyonians to the event, the suitors and Cleisthenes found themselves surrounded by eyes that were both fascinated by the spectacle of the aristocracy and ready to judge its behavior. Let us now try to imagine the scene. Normally, one would think of a feast taking place at the house of the father of the future wife. In the case of a tyrant, we might also imagine a public banqueting hall, except that archaeology has revealed no room able to contain such a large number of individuals. As far as I know, even the largest spaces of which we are aware, where several dozens people could find space in separate rooms, would not fit our story. All the more so, since it is clear that the presence of a very large number of people in that of a few dozen individuals. It is better, rather, to think of a situation similar to the great sacrifice that the Pylians offered to Poseidon in the Odyssey, in which, according to the poet, 9 times 500 people took part. Fortunately for us, an almost contemporary, detailed description of such situation can be found in a scene from Euripides' Ion. Towards the end of the tragedy, the young protagonist devotes himself to the organization of a great feast in the city of Delphi. The task to describe such preparations to Euripides' audience is entrusted to a servant, and I apologize that I did not manage to put both the Greek text and its translation in a single slide. The passage was simply too long. So I read the translation while you can look at the Greek on the screen. The youth reverently established the board, taking good care of the rays of the sun, setting it neither towards the middle beams of it, nor in turn towards the ending ones. He measured a length at platform for a square, having its wall area 10,000 feet, as the wise say, so that he might call all the people of Delphi to the feast. From the treasuries, he took tapestries to cast shade, a wonder for men to see. Ion set up golden mixing bowls in the middle of the banquet. The herald, standing on tiptoes, was inviting any native of Delphi who wished to come to the feast. When the tent was filled, they crowned themselves with garlands and ate the rich food to satiety, came by and stood in the midst, and he raised a great laugh among the guests by his zealous actions. For he brought water for washing hands from the pitchers, and burned the myrtle incense, and ruled over the golden cups, assigning this duty to himself. When it was time for music and the public ball, the old man said, "We must take away the small wine vessels and bring in the big ones, so that they may come to their pleasures more quickly." Ion's feast is called a dice, but also toine and deipnon, like the banquet of Sicyon. Like the banquet of Sicyon, this feast includes a symposium, but the similarities do not end here. In both Sicyon and Delphi, the occasion, respectively a marriage and the symbolic birth of a child, requires a great sacrifice, and all the inhabitants of the city are invited to participate. In both cases, nothing is said about the status of the guests. And in Sicyon, as in Delphi, the guests seems to be all gathered in the same space, and the meals are followed by the music of the aulos and by wine. In her groundbreaking book on civic symposia, Pauline Schmidt-Pontel writes that Euripides has invented this banquet by putting together the elements of other stories. However, since we are comparing one story with another, a theatrical rhesis with a popular anecdote, it is not the historical characteristics of civic banquets that matter, but rather the fact that the portrait of a social situation like Ion's feast could be submitted by Euripides to his Athenian audience, and that this latter immediately understood it, thanks to either direct knowledge or a montage of imagined yet realistic moments. Certainly, the depiction had to be neutral, almost banal, if instead of staging the banquet, Euripides could entrust its verbal description to the servant without risking losing his audience. More than 60 verses pass between the beginning of the rhesis and its Spannung, that is the first mention of the poison at verse 1185. It is on the basis of these considerations that I suggest locating the feast for the wedding of Agariste in a single large temporary pavilion as it is in the Ion. Like the one in the Euripidean play, the Sicyonian pavilion would have been provided with a central space that most guests could see. And it is around this central area that Cleisthenes and the suitors would have been placed, with tables and seats for the other guests arranged at the periphery. Such a disposition matches what we can read in Herodotus' very text. The suitors vied with each other in music and in anecdotes for all to hear, as to meson, which literally means in the middle. The tyrant and the suitors are both at the physical center and at the center of attention of the Sicyonians. Based on these assumptions, we can now visualize Agariste's wedding feast in two stages, each of which will allow us to evaluate the behavior of one of the protagonists. Let us begin with Hippocleides. Let's consider the center of the scene, occupied by Cleisthenes, the suitors, and various Sicyonian dignitaries. This inner circle of guests functions much like an ordinary aristocratic banquet, where members of the elite share the same code of behaviors and carefully watch each other's conduct in order to solidify their group identity. The respect for the norms of politeness to which every individual is bound is motivated by the need not to harm the collective representation, which in turn supports the social identity of each individual. The guarantor of this is, of course, Cleisthenes, the master of the house, who has arranged the space and created the condition for such representation to take place. Any lack of manners in the aristocratic banquet is hence likely to be an affront to the master of the house. This is indeed what happened when Hippocleides, I quote, ordered the flute player to play him a dance tune. The flute player obeyed and began to dance. And by all means, he pleased himself with his dancing, but Cleisthenes saw the whole business with much disfavor. Hippocleides then stopped for a while and ordered the table to be brought in. When the table arrived, he danced Laconian figures on it first, and then Attic. Last of all, he rested his head on the table and made gestures with his legs in the air. Now, Cleisthenes at the first and the second bout of dancing could no more bear to think of Hippocleides as his son-in-law because of his dancing and his shamelessness, but he had held himself in check, not wanting to explode at Hippocleides. But when he saw him making gestures with his legs, he could no longer keep silence. Even if Herodotus makes only a short allusion to this subject, the consumption of wine might help explain the young man's hybris. Although frequent, drunkenness was in fact considered to be a lack of good manners in the context of the symposium, because even if wine could have beneficial effects on the body and speech, the custom was to drink it diluted with water, precisely to extend the duration of the evening without the guests losing control of their tongues and bodies. Lyric poetry emphasized this point. The oft-quoted verses of Xenophanes regarding good behavior at a banquet are explicit about the limits not to be exceeded. And the Theognidaea also warn against the loss of bodily control caused by wine. The ideal of reason that controls one's instincts, the sophrosune, dominates the nomoi sympathikoi, which are borrowed from the principles of equality and shared speech. It should, however, be remembered that there is also, from the archaic period onward, a poetic vein that explicitly invites one to drink in order to reach drunkenness and to forget one's worries. A fragment of Alcitus describes the effects of wine and the ambivalence that surrounds them. The text has several lacunae. The poet seems to be describing the state of one who, having recovered from drunkenness, regrets words spoken under the influence of wine. Wine calms the heart, but also takes hold of the mind. There is, however, another possible reading. Alcitus may also refer to the condition of the drunken man, that wine continually leads back to thoughts of painful circumstances, no doubt those he had wanted to forget when drinking. The poem would thus describe the contradictory effects of wine. This reading is interesting for my discussion because it would account for the very condition of escaping reality and self-absorption that characterizes Hippocleides during his dance. Herodotus says it clearly. It is Hippocleides' self-satisfaction with his talent that makes him forget all restraint. It is, in fact, a progressive loss of contact. Little by little, the Athenian seems to swap his attention from the real audience to an egotistical gaze. The tale told by Herodotus represents this shift through the sequence of increasingly inappropriate dance figures. Although Hippocleides seems to have forgotten it, he is surrounded by people who are watching him. What is important for us, however, is that Cleisthenes does not intervene immediately. While at first glance, it might seem peculiar that the host allows Hippocleides to continue, it is in fact predictable. Silence with regard to the behavior of others at the banquet is what the nomoi sympathikoi prescribe, as we read in another passage from the Theognidaea. Among one's fellow diners, let a man have his wits about him. Let everything seem to escape his notice as if he were not there. The tyrant acts appropriately for a master of the house. He watches and tolerates, pretending not to be affected by Hippocleides' behavior. Cleisthenes' initial reaction fits well within the framework of a traditional elite banquet. Admittedly, within such a social situation, it is not entirely correct to order the musicians to play when one is not the symposiarch. It is also not customary for guests at a banquet, no matter how skillful they might be, to start dancing on their own. This notwithstanding, Cleisthenes still seems to hope that Hippocleides will stop. it is perhaps necessary to clarify why these sorts of behavior are not suited to a banquet. According to Marek Wentowski's recent definition, a symposium is a culture-oriented drinking occasion of simultaneously egalitarian and competitive character. In other words, it is a ritual that ensures the equality of the guests and at the same time encourages competition between them. Symposia are supervised by the symposiarch, but the ultimate guarantor is the master of the oikos in which the banquet takes place. It is clear that by asking the elite to play and by getting on the table, Hippocleides not only prevents the continuation of the musical competition, but also breaks the principle of equality of the guests by monopolizing the attention of the audience. This is key to the interpretation of the maxima of Theognis and consequently of Cleisthenes' attitude toward Hippocleides. It seems as if the master of the house is setting an example for the other guests. Deviant behavior would be punished by indifference, and the perpetrator would be encouraged to stop and withdraw, humiliated by the lack of attention. And this strategy might have even worked, hadn't Hippocleides been, as we said, totally absorbed by himself and oblivious to his surroundings. And when he stands on his head, the young Athenian doesn't even look like a man anymore. It is at this point that Cleisthenes' priorities change. Indeed, there can be no public reproach to Hippocleides that does not imply a breach in the very sympathetic atmosphere that Cleisthenes had been trying to preserve. As Marek Wentowski emphasizes in a forthcoming paper that he kindly shared with me, I quote, "Normally, the decision about the winner of a particular sympathetic game or performance belongs to all the participants of the banquet. Cleisthenes dissipates the last shadow of illusion of the sympathetic freedom, which logically proves impossible at a tyrant's court." End of the quote. The political dimension is indeed a determining factor in understanding Cleisthenes' anger and the change in his behavior. It is now time to broaden our analysis to the other guests, that is, to all those people of diverse social extraction who surrounded the central aristocratic banquet. Surrounded by his Sicyonian subjects, Cleisthenes must protect not only his social identity as a sophisticated and liberal host, but also and above all, his identity as a tyrant. In fact, an event such as the feast for the wedding of Agariste represents for Cleisthenes an ideal occasion to reinforce his hold over the Sicyonians and to guarantee the recognition of his role as ruler of the city. The spectacular dimension of the event allows for a staging of his authority. The tyrant can achieve this effect by seeking greatness. There is hardly a more obvious manifestation of power than the ability to arrange and transform physical space. The fact that he wanted to invite all Sicyonians to the feast is already part of this strategy, because in order to do so, one must be able to arrange a suitable space. This promises to arouse the admiration and respect of the Sicyonians, but does not eliminate the risk of losing face in front of them should something go wrong. All the more so, since, as we have seen, Cleisthenes was probably dealing with a critical audience. The support of the inner circle of guests, that is the participation of the aristocratic pretenders in the success of the representation of grandeur and prestige that the tyrant stages for his subjects, obviously represents an asset for Cleisthenes' social identity. Hence, Hippocleides' dance can hardly be read as a mere inelegant interruption of the banquet. It is also a dangerous attack on the public image of a tyrant. This is why Cleisthenes, after some initial hesitation, is forced to react. Indeed, after his first strategy fails, Cleisthenes' position evolves and becomes more difficult, because as the young man's dance becomes coarse, it is less the good name of Cleisthenes as a householder hosting a banquet than the public image of Cleisthenes, tyrant of Sicyon, choosing an heir in front of all his subjects, that is threatened. If Cleisthenes' initial response to Hippocleides was understandable in terms of the code of behavior expected at the traditional aristocratic banquet, its change in strategy can be explained by the need to interrupt one social representation in favor of another, more urgent one. Cleisthenes accepts to discredit himself as a householder so as not to risk losing face as a tyrant. What is the symbolic challenge to the authority of the tyrant instigated by Hippocleides' upside-down dance? Critics have proposed various interpretations. I base my considerations on Daniel Ogden's hypothesis, also taken up by Brian Lavelle. No certainty exists about this proposition, but it is nevertheless seductive. The dance which offended Cleisthenes, Ogden says, was clearly an obscene one that displayed Hippocleides' genitals. And Cleisthenes' response ostensibly means, you have danced away your marriage. But the apas aporkezao also puns significantly on orches, testicles. You have lost your marriage by displaying your testicles. Possibly even, you have bolstered up your marriage. Ogden's interpretation is supported by a number of iconographic witnesses showing semi-human beings, caricatures, or more likely dwarfs, dancing on tables at symposia, as indicated by the garlands of flowers on their heads or the goblets of wine they hold in their hands. One of these vase fragments, dating from the third quarter of the 5th century, shows a crowned dancing dwarf above whose head one can read Cleides, plausibly completed to read Hippocleides. Unfortunately, I could not either get access to a library or find pictures of these vases out online, but Brian Lavelle has recently added to this list a psicter signed by Duris and housed in the British Museum that was available on the internet. This red figure vase shows a group of satyrs drinking and dancing in a context that could be considered to be symposiastic. It so happens that one of these naked figures is standing on his hands, legs in the air. Another satyr, moving toward the handstander, is aroused to erection. According to Lavelle, this reaction is not due to the satyr's view of the genitals of his fellow, but rather apparently because of his buttocks, which are right in front of him. This reading of the vase leads Lavelle to conclude that when Hippocleides, at the height of his show, starts dancing on his hands, his behavior ceases to be simply rude and becomes rather homoerotically suggestive. It was certainly not, I am quoting, what Greek sons-in-law to be should be up to, especially as wedding banquets. What value does Hippocleides indeed attribute to Agariste if on his wedding day he shows interest toward other lovers? No one is in the position to confirm Lavelle's hypothesis, but it is a good explanation for Cleisthenes' sudden change of strategy. The symbolic implications of the dance that Hippocleides performed in front of all the Sicyonians cast a bad light on Cleisthenes' public image as a tyrant. How could a man who is not even able to choose an Agathos spouse for his daughter make the right decision for the city? How could a father who allows himself to be so insulted by a young man be able to claim the highest degree of time of Sicyon? The symbolic power of Hippocleides' behavior is such that the Sicyonian public will not be able to hold it for the mere mark of pretentious eccentricity of a young member of the elite who has not yet learned to behave. The Sicyonians would see it rather as an affront to the dignity and authority of their tyrant lord. It was therefore necessary to intervene, even if it meant allowing the atmosphere of the banquet to deteriorate. Finally, the social situation of the wedding banquet engaged the tyrant in two distinct representations, which in light of Hippocleides' behavior, it becomes impossible to maintain simultaneously. Indeed, the code of politeness assumes here both a prescriptive value, because it requires the protection of the egalitarian and competitive balance of the symposium, and an hermeneutic value, because it provides all the individuals present with the tools to recognize in Hippocleides' dance an insult to the public image of the tyrant. Hence the necessity for Cleisthenes to make a choice destined to undermine one of the two social representations. Moral of the story. When Cleisthenes interrupts his frantic dance, Hippocleides is suddenly forced to return to reality. It is at that moment that the young Athenian pronounces the famous words that Herodotus puts in his mouth, "O frontis Hippocleides." Beyond the etiological considerations, commentators have proposed several interpretations of the proverbial response. By approaching it from the angle of the definition of politeness I have proposed above, I see in this response a communicative strategy intending to minimize damage. After a whole year of success, Hippocleides has just lost faith in front of Cleisthenes, his friends, and his competitors for the hand of Agariste, not to mention all the Sicyonians. But there is a fact that remains true, whatever the exact meaning of Hippocleides' answer to Cleisthenes. Among all the possible ways of capitulating, such as trying to counter a tyrant's claims, asking for forgiveness, leaving silently with his eyes to the ground, etc., he chooses the only way that does not imply any emotive assumption of the humiliation. Very simply, he denies ever having taken seriously the role of a noble shooter, as well as the etiquette following which he would have made sure to be recognized as such. Instead of accepting that he has been excluded from the competition, he pretends to have already decided on his own. If he must be assessed through the quality of his manners, he simply refuses to acknowledge having been part of the social situation that determined the importance of these manners. In Herodotus' tale, in short, Hippocleides behaves like the fox in Aesop. Unable to reach the grapes, even though he leapt with all his strength, the fox tells himself and everybody else that he actually never wanted the grapes. Rather than apologizing by acknowledging that he had exceeded the limits of decency, Hippocleides shows nothing but contempt for the pride of the young man to thank, so much the worse for him. Hippocleides prefers substance over forms. Herodotus' audience, however, had been prevented. The value judgment that Cleisthenes exerts on the shooters is defined by androgatia, orge, paidosis, and tropos. Any decision for the tyrant will take relies on the intersection of these four concepts, two of which relate to the disposition of the mind, and two of which relate to a body technique, that is, the aesthetics of expression in all its forms, appearance, speech, and actions. Since to pass the selection process, the candidate must possess all of these qualities, the assessment criterion promoted by the tale that Herodotus relates can rightly be classified as socio-aesthetic. The rule is that appearance corresponds to essence, all the more so as the context where the action takes place is that of a meeting of the elite to which this ideology belonged and which promoted its diffusion in the other social strata. Cleisthenes, as we have seen, had given special attention to the suitor's behavior during the meals. In the light of what we have said, it is now easier to understand the reason for this. In archaic Greece, sociability functioned as a mirror of the identity of the elite. However, the adoption of appropriate conduct on the part of an individual demonstrates not only his adherence to the ideology of the ruling group, but also his willingness to work to strengthen the social order advocated by that group. It is because Hippocleides' conduct constitutes a breach of this order that Cleisthenes takes the situation in hand and publicly chastises him. He then hastens to redress the social representation that Hippocleides has endangered, and with it as image of tyrant. Once again, the timeo of the tyrant is reaffirmed in front of the Sicyonians by displaying greatness and generosity. Cleisthenes takes advantage of the sudden silence and, "Suitors for my daughter's hand," he announces, "I thank you one and all. If it were possible, I would grant each of you his wish, neither choosing out one to set him above another, nor disparaging the rest. But since I have but one maiden to plan for, and so cannot please all of you, to those of you whose suit is rejected, I make a gift of a talent of silver to each. For his desire to take a wife from my house, and for his sojourn away from his own. And to Megacles, son of Alcmaeon, do I betroth my daughter, Agariste. Cleisthenes' words of praise for the suitors, as well as his great munificence towards them, are those of a perfect host vis-a-vis his Xenos. The correct relationship between Cleisthenes and his guests, and thus the time of the tyrant, is hence forcefully reaffirmed. But the real coup, the one that everyone, aristocrat or simple guest citizen, would remember forever, is the treatment reserved for Hippocleides. For it seems indeed that Cleisthenes includes him among the losing suitors, to whom he offers his tremendous consolation gift. It is hard to imagine a more elegant way to return to the attitude of tolerant superiority expected of a proper householder. Hippocleides' impertinent reply is ignored, his provocation is not taken up, and his attempt to deny he ever wanted the role that was his own fails. Ou frontis Cleisthene, tyrant of Sicyon. Thank you.